Greetings, humans. Welcome back to Sci-Fi Punks, where we talk all things sci-fi, movies, comics, video games, novels. If it's sci-fi, I am into it, and I want to blab about it here. And today, I want to talk about the problems with the Terminator franchise. Now, when anybody says problem and Terminator franchise in the same sentence, they're usually talking about all of the Terminator movies that aren't the first two. So, because generally speaking, everyone agrees that the first two Terminator movies are untouchable and they're awesome. Almost everybody likes those movies, and then it's a pretty big mixed bag when it comes to all the other sequels. And there are quite a few of them. I think we've got... So today we're going to be talking about Terminator 3, Terminator Genesis, Terminator Salvation, and Terminator Dark Fate. Those are all the sequels we're going to be going over today, because there's not much that I can say about the first two films that hasn't already been said. They are unanimously loved by many people. There are some assholes out there that don't like the second movie. I don't know what their problem is. I have a good friend of mine. He's actually the engineer that records all of my band's music. We have been feuding about this for like literally 20 years. He's an older guy and he does not like Terminator 2. He's one of those guys. And his complaints are usually the same as a lot of people's who don't like the second film. It's that it's just too Hollywood. See, the first Terminator film is this really gritty, low budget, condensed singular story, but then the second movie comes along and it's just full-on Hollywood blockbuster bullshit. That's kind of the criticism you hear about the second film. I mean, it obviously is the template of the modern Hollywood blockbuster. Like, everything we've gotten out of Hollywood action films for the last 30 years or so has been because of Terminator 2. That's true, but Terminator 2 was done so earnestly with so much love that all of its like goofy one-liners and its kind of cheesy plot about a machine discovering love and stuff like that, it kind of earns it in a way because it's done with just a bunch of real earnestness. And the movie also takes itself very seriously where it needs to. It doesn't lose itself in its comedy. Its comedy is... There's not a lot of comedy in Terminator 2. People kind of look back on it and think of it as like when things kind of got really silly. There's only a few parts here and there that are kind of silly, and I think they're done really well. So I see that criticism, the kind of Hollywoodification of the Terminator franchise starts with Terminator 2, but I just think that Terminator 2 earns it. The other criticism with Terminator 2 that people, like really geeky people, like to bring up is that it's kind of all... It shouldn't exist. In the storyline of the Terminator lore, Terminator 2 really shouldn't exist. Like, if you're not familiar with the first two Terminator movies, then this is going to be way too nerdy for you and you shouldn't be watching this. But I'm just going to quickly say that in the first Terminator movie, the character Kyle Reese, who's from the future, explains that where he's from, the human resistance has beaten the machines and the war is over, and that after that, the machines sent a Terminator back in time as a last-ditch effort. And so after Kyle Reese defeats the Terminator back in the 80s, then the war is really over. There's no more fighting. The humans have won for good. And that's kind of the story of the first Terminator movie. But then the second movie comes along, and another Terminator inexplicably travels back in time, 2 more this time, and goes after John Connor again. And this kind of ignores the plot point that Kyle Reese says about how the humans won the war, and that after the first movie, there should be no more time travel. They destroyed the time machine. So after the first movie, time travel, there should be nobody else going back through time. How does this explain the second movie then? Because obviously more people went back in time, or more machines went back in time. There's just a million number of ways you can say, oh, well, the machines had a backup time machine or whatever. There's just a million things you could say that would justify why there's still more time travel shenanigans happening. So I don't really care about that plot hole. I find that you can work around it if you really want to. And I believe Terminator 2 is such a good movie that it deserves for you to kind of just work around that plot hole. I know it's a little bit of a contrivance, but I think that it's worth it because what you get is so good. Anyways, but that's all I'm going to say about the first two movies because, yeah, like other than that, they're pretty damn good. Honestly, I love them both to death. I remember I watched both of them when I was still a little kid, and And to this day, I recognize them as some of the best films ever made. James Cameron, I honestly think that James Cameron is one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. Even if you don't like some of his more recent output, I think that it does not matter. He gave us the Terminator movies, the first two, and he gave us Aliens. He's brought in so much awesome into this world that, like, I am pro James Cameron. So the problems start for me with Terminator 3. Now, when I was a kid, I wanted sequels to everything. I wanted sequels to absolutely everything that I liked. I just wanted more of everything. I was a dumb little kid. However, I remember watching Terminator 2 and thinking at the end of the movie that the ending was so good and so conclusive that when I first started hearing rumors about Terminator 3 possibly being made, I remember thinking to myself, that would be cool, but like, do we really need a third one? Because the ending was so good. The second movie's ending basically is so conclusive. It basically goes out of its way to like tie up all the loose ends and say, there is no way the story could go forward. We have beaten Skynet into the ground and now we're going to live in peace. The second movie just draws that line right in the sand and says no more. It's like set in stone. And so I was really interested, when I heard they were making a third Terminator movie, I was really interested to see what sort of explanation there would be for why a third movie could even happen. I really had faith that the Hollywood writers were going to be so well trained and so smart that they would come up with a really cool explanation for why Terminator 3 could even happen after the conclusive ending of the second film. So when I went into the theater with my best friend James back in 2003 to see Terminator 3, that was the number one thing I was looking forward to, was seeing what sort of explanation there was. And sure enough, the moment comes where John Connor says to the Terminator, hey, you shouldn't even exist. We stopped Cyberdyne. We stopped Skynet. How are you even here? And I was like, I remember being in the theater being like, okay, here it goes. Like, what sort of explanation do they have for this? And then the Terminator replies, you only postponed Judgment Day. Judgment Day is inevitable. And I was like, that's it? You really couldn't come up with anything better than that? You know, like, Judgment Day is inevitable. That's all they could do. So the messaging of the second film was no fate but what we make. Sarah Connor carves it into a picnic table. She says, no fate. That was like the theme of the second movie, was that, no, you can change the future. Nothing is set in stone. You can take control of your life and you can change things for the better if you want to. It's a really good message. One of the more profound messages we've ever gotten out of Hollywood, in my opinion. It's a simple message, but it's good, you know? But then the third movie comes along and says, well, we didn't have any better ideas, so yeah, there is fate. You can postpone fate, but you can't stop it. And I hate that. So right then, the movie lost me. The third movie just lost me right there. But of course, that's not the only problem with the third Terminator movie. There are lots of other ones. The third Terminator movie is a parody of the first two. It's really, really silly. It does not take itself seriously, and it doesn't have any new ideas. Like, you have a metal skeleton Terminator in the first movie, then you have a liquid metal Terminator in the second movie. So what do you do in the third movie? Oh, I don't know. You put them together. That's the best they could come up with. It's just mashing them together. Oh, but it's a girl this time. And story-wise, plot-wise, it basically follows the same beats as the first two films. So it has no new ideas. Its tone is completely off base with the first two films. And this is obviously because it's not directed by James Cameron. One of the reasons why I think the tone is sort of off from the first two films is actually a very simple reason. It's because nothing is shot at night. The whole movie is set in the daytime, and the first two movies mostly take place at night. And I actually think that alone contributes to the kind of tone mismatch of the third film with the rest of them. But yeah, I've always thought that the third film was a major disappointment, and in my head, it just is not canon. I have noticed online that much like the Star Wars prequels and Nickelback, the third Terminator film has kind of developed a bit of like some like, I don't know, contrarian sympathy from people, and now people are coming out of the woodwork and saying that it's actually pretty good. You're wrong. This is not one of those cases where something was kind of treated unfairly when it came out and actually deserves more credit than it gets. No, Terminator 3 fucking sucks. It's a stupid ass film, and we should just leave it at that. It's not boring though, and I do have a ranking scale in my head where you automatically get a passing grade if you're not boring, even if you've got bad writing, bad dialogue, bad special effects, a plot that makes no sense. If you're not boring, you're still automatically a 5 out of 10. And so I guess Terminator 3 is a 5 out of 10 for me because, yeah, it's not boring. Like, it's fun to watch. It's just stupid as fuck and does not deserve to be in the same franchise as the first two movies. So after that, we got something really interesting. We got Terminator Salvation. Because anybody who watched the original first two movies remembers those awesome future scenes where it shows the post-apocalyptic future war of humans versus machines, where the humans are fighting giant robots with laser guns. And we only get brief flashbacks of that in the first two films and in the third movie. And so a lot of people said, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we got a whole movie like that? And so they gave us this with Terminator Salvation. It's got Christian Bale starring as John Connor, which is a pretty good choice. Like, we were a little bailed out at this point in time because he was in the middle of doing the Batman movies, and he basically is playing just like a gruffer Bruce Wayne. But he is a good choice to play John Connor. In my head, that makes sense to me. But the movie is definitely, I think, one of the best of the bad Terminator sequels. It's just, it is pretty boring. For some reason, it just kind of drags on. And the plot is goofy. You have a character who's a mix of machine and human, and he doesn't know who he is. He has no memory, and it's just kind of boring, kind of very typical stuff that we've seen before a million times. It doesn't really bring anything new or interesting to the table. And one of the big crimes that it commits is that the future war that it depicts doesn't look anything like the flashbacks that we saw in the first two films. They're not shooting laser guns. There was a period for a while in Hollywood during like the early 2000s where Hollywood was afraid of laser guns. The Michael Bay Transformers movies also do this, where for some reason futuristic robots from outer space shoot artillery at each other. They have bullets. Like, it makes sense that they would have something more advanced, doesn't it? But for some reason, Hollywood thought that laser beams were cheesy. No more lasers. So Transformers, they shot bullets, and the same thing happens here with Terminator Salvation. Everyone's shooting bullets at each other, and so we don't get the cool looking, like, you know, the cool looking pew pew future war aesthetic that we saw in the flashbacks in the first two Terminator films. It's this kind of just really boring, grungy, dirty, desert, post-apocalyptic thing that we've seen a million times other places. And so it doesn't really bring anything new to the table aesthetic-wise. I would still say, though, that it takes itself seriously. Its tone fits a lot closer to the first two films. It's really trying to be a real Terminator movie. And so for that, I give it a lot of credit, and kind of think that it should be a little higher ranked on people's lists. Then we really fell into the shit with Terminator Genisys, which came out in 2015. Oh boy, now this for me has to be the most frustrating of the Terminator sequels. It does a lot of really cool things. Like, they show us the future war once again, and this time it looks right. It looks like the way it's depicted in the first two films. You've got the lasers. This movie aesthetically looks awesome. It does a lot of things correct with the aesthetics, but it suffers the most from the time that it was made. It's such a film that came out in the 2010s. It's so Marvel quippy. It looks really generic. And of course, it hires two of the worst casting choices ever. I just do not believe Emilia Clarke as Sarah Connor for 1 minute. She's just the most basic white bitch that they could ever have picked. And it's only because she was popular. That's why they got her in the role. And she's just terribly miscast in this film. And then we have Jai Courtney. Originally, Kyle Reese was played by Michael Biehn in the first Terminator movie, and they recast him with Jai Courtney. And this is also a really, really, really bad casting choice. Because Michael Biehn was this kind of stringy dude. He looked like somebody that grew up in the trenches in a post-apocalyptic war. You really believed his character, that's where he came from. But Jai Courtney looks like he's hitting the gym 3 times a day, eating plenty of protein powder and creatine. Like, he does not look like someone who was starving and fighting and grew up fighting in this horrible war his whole life. He also looks like the most basic man ever. Like when they sent the Voyager 2 space probe into outer space with like the depictions of what humans look like on them, the man looks like Jive Courtney. Like it's just like he's like the most typical looking dude. So Terminator Genisys has really frustrating casting choices. Arnold Schwarzenegger's back as well. And he does a good job, obviously. He's playing the role really silly and stupid, but I blame that more on the writing than his acting. The plot is bonkers. The plot is so overly complex with its time travel shenanigans, and you can also tell that they're just setting up for a sequel that never got made. So there's a whole bunch of loose ends that don't make any sense, and you never really know whether or not you're never even really sure if the writers even knew what they were doing. And it's just a very unsatisfying story because, yeah, like they were hoping to make sequels to this film. The mid-2000s is ground zero for sequel bait movies. Like everything that was coming out from Hollywood at that point in time was trying to bait you into a franchise. The special effects are pretty good. A lot of things look really cool. There is a really fucking bad helicopter chase though that is just completely CGI. Nothing looks real, and the movie's bad for some of that kind of stuff. There's one thing about Terminator Genisys that a lot of people don't like, and I actually think is the coolest part of the movie. Terminator Genisys makes the choice of turning John Connor into the bad guy. Because there's some time travel shenanigans, John Connor is turned into a Terminator, and he's the bad guy now. He's the antagonist of this film. And a lot of people hate that choice. And I personally love that. I think that's exactly the sort of shakeup the franchise needed to be different and interesting. Because, I don't know, John Connor is not that interesting of a character. Like, he's really cool in Terminator 2 when he's this, like, punk kid. But after that, he's just some guy. He's never really been that interesting. I don't find him to be, like, the sacred cow that you can't violate anyway. So turning him into the bad guy, I thought was kind of an interesting choice. And I credit the film for that. But yeah, Terminator Genisys, it's just really, really Hollywood in the worst possible way. It's got so many cringe moments. It's the cringiest of the Terminator movies. And yeah, I don't believe anything. The acting's bad everywhere. It really feels like it was made by a committee. So yeah, Terminator Genisys is a bad movie. Again, not boring though. It's very fun to watch. I watched it a couple nights ago. I enjoyed myself, but I was cringing and laughing the whole time. But yeah, so 5 out of 10 once again. And then finally, we got Terminator Dark Fate a few years ago. And this one really looked like they were trying to say, okay, we realize we fucked up a few times. We want to make a real Terminator 3. We're really going to try to make a real sequel to the first two movies. We're going to ignore everything else we made and make a sequel directly to the first two movies. We're going to try our best to match the tone, and we're even going to get Linda Hamilton to come back as Sarah Connor. And to me, this was awesome. I was so excited for this film because it looked like they were really going to try to get it right this time. They got this close to pulling it off. They just made a few mistakes that kind of just totally derailed it, the whole thing. Bringing Linda Hamilton back as Sarah Connor was a really, really awesome idea and really helps the movie. It really helps legitimize it as a sequel to Terminator 2 for me. The controversial choice of killing John Connor off at the beginning of the film that a lot of people hate is another one of those shakeups that I appreciate. I did think that was an interesting way to get things rolling again and change things up. Because again, to me, John Connor, he's more of a MacGuffin. I don't really find him to be that interesting of a character himself. What he represents is important, but the character himself to me has never been super important. So killing him off was never that offensive to me. I actually thought it was kind of cool. Where the movie goes wrong, again, is in its lack of creativity. Again, we're faced with the same question. Okay, so why is the sequel even happening? How are things still happening after they beat Cyberdyne in the second film? And again, the only answer they can come up with is, oh, Judgment Day is inevitable. There's always going to be an AI that takes over the world. You can't stop it, so you're just going to have to deal with it. That's the best they can come up with, and I hate that as a jumping off point for Terminator 3. I just think that's really lazy. I want them to come up with something better than that, because what that does is it totally just ruins and negates the sacrifice. All of the pain and suffering that the characters go through in the second Terminator film to save the future, all of that gets completely erased and is made irrelevant by saying Judgment Day is inevitable in Terminator 3 and Terminator Dark Fate. And so it really loses me there once again. And as well, like, yeah, it's got a lack of creativity. We just have another Terminator that comes back in time to kill our characters. Only this time, it's like liquid metal and a regular robot. It can split into two characters this time and be two Terminators at once. That is fucking really, really lame. I could have come up with that as a fucking 8-year-old kid. Like, that is just not an interesting idea. And yeah, it chases our characters down. Arnold Schwarzenegger's a good guy again, and he fights them, and he helps them fight this new Terminator. And it's just no new ideas. The movie is appropriately dark. Its tone is really appropriate. It takes itself seriously, but it has a really confusing plot that doesn't make any sense again. It does a whole bunch of sequel baiting, and it just drops the ball all over the place. The acting's a lot better. The characters are a little bit better. And like I said, having Linda Hamilton back in the role as Sarah Connor really helps the film. Arnold Schwarzenegger is really, really good. And he even has a really, really awesome moment where the Terminator that he plays is the Terminator that kills John Connor at the beginning of the movie. And then he goes off into hiding for like 30 years. And he actually, since his programming was completed, he goes and starts a family and just kind of settles into his life. And I think that's kind of an interesting concept to me. But it's just not enough to save the movie from its shortcomings. But I will say it is the best version of a Terminator 3 that we've gotten so far. I would almost accept it, but it just plot-wise drops the ball too much for me. And so in my opinion, there are still only 2 Terminator movies in my headcanon, and the only 2 that really matter are Terminator 1 and Terminator 2. That's just how I feel. They're just untouchable. Nothing has come out since that even comes close to those movies. And I don't think the franchise really has legs. Like something like Aliens and Star Wars, I think a lot of these things, there's lots of room to play. I think you could make lots of sequels to these movies if they're done well. I think they could justify themselves. But the Terminator just can't figure it out. The first 2 movies just wrap everything up so neatly and they do everything that you could possibly need to do with this franchise. Anything that they've ever made since just can't justify its own existence. Anyways, that's my opinion on the Terminator franchise. I guess that's all I'm going to say today. All hail Megatron.